Just to recap briefly, we are now in the prophetic chapters of the book of Daniel. Before this, we were looking at a combination. Chapter 2 was prophetic, and then you had 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, which was historical, but also what we saw was that even in the history, there was prophetic symbolism and prophetic typology. The history of Daniel represents a prophecy in a secondary way because it tells the story of things that will happen in the future, but kind of like in a parable form, whereas the prophecies are more direct. So we saw in Daniel chapter 2 that there are 4 great empires that is to be succeeded by a 5th and final empire, which is the everlasting kingdom of Jesus Christ. I saw a video. Somebody asked me to take a look at a video this week where it was being suggested that the 4th empire is not really Rome, but rather the Islamic Empire. And the person was making the point that Babylon, Medo Persia, and Greece, these empires were focused very strongly on the eastern part, the Middle East, North Africa, and some parts of Europe. But Rome was mostly Europe. That's what the person on the video is saying. And so they were saying that the 4th empire is the Islamic Empire. Well, there are several reasons why I wouldn't agree with that, and primarily because when you come to the end of the Greek Empire, who else takes control? Who else becomes the dominant power in the biblical world? How do you just bypass Rome and act like Rome never existed? Rome was the next great dominant power, and in fact, it was more dominant, more rapacious, more cruel than Babylon, Medo Persia, and Greece, and lasted longer than all of them, as a matter of fact. And it's true that when we come down to the end of time, like today, Islam seems to be a dominant power that has a lot of impact on what is happening in the world. But there is no way you can say that. First of all, Islam is not a unified force, right? You have Islamic countries, and they are united on some things, right? Like, for example, in their antipathy towards the Western world and towards what they regard as American aggression, they are united. But the Islamic world is not united under one empire. Many people believe that it's going to be united under the Turkish empire. The Turkish government, the Turkish kingdom is going to rise up and become the head of the Islamic coalition, and they will again become a dominant power in the world. But right now, this is not a reality, and for the past many thousands of years in the biblical world, the dominant power from the time of Jesus, right through the entire New Testament, the dominant power was the Roman Empire. The power that destroyed Jerusalem, the power that rose against Jesus, the power that killed the Prince of Princes, is Rome. So there are many pointers that point to Rome, and because of this, I wouldn't agree that it's the Islamic Empire at all. There are several dominant entities in the world today that I don't think I can find a place where they are specifically mentioned in prophecy. Like, for example, China. The closest I can see China in the Bible is there's a reference in could be Isaiah, where it talks about the land of Sinim, and somebody said once that it refers to China, which I haven't been able to do the kind of background check to find out if that is true, but somebody said this one time. But there are entities like this that are very influential in the world today. China is one. Okay, you could think of places that the world considers dominant and strong like North Korea. The thing is, as we discussed before, many people believe that the prophecies are concerned about the politics of the world, and I believe this is wrong. You know, one of the things that you find about many people who claim to be prophets, they come and they tell you that there's going to be a disaster in this country or that country, or they tell you who's going to be president of this place or this place, and they're focused on politics, and they think that God, the purpose of prophecy is to give you information about the politics of the planet, and I believe this is wrong. Prophecy is concerned about political powers where they affect the destiny of God's people and of God's movement. If we can bear this in mind, I think it will give us a guide as to how to approach the prophecies. Powers, political powers, are involved where they have an impact on the cause of God or upon the people of God. Other than that, even though they may be great dominant world powers, they may not be mentioned in prophecy at all. Somebody will say, but this is not how it was in the Old Testament, and I will agree, because the Old Testament was a in the Old Testament times, God was dealing with a political people. He was dealing with a people in a political setting. It was a nation that was at war against the other nations of the world. God's people were a particular nation, and the other nations were mostly at war against Israel. So the history of those nations in a political sense was very important in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, God's people are not a political people. So the politics of the world is not significant in the New Testament unless it overlaps with the destiny of God's people. So you find that in the New Testament you have Babylon. That's one of the things that the guy said on the video. He said the fourth kingdom, the fourth empire, it has to be in the same area of Babylon. And he says when you look at the area of Babylon today, you see the Muslims are in charge of it. Medo Persia, Greece. And he says, I'm sorry, he says there are certain nations that are mentioned and they are not a part of Europe. But again, this has to do with the fact that people misread the prophecies. Because when you come to the New Covenant time, Babylon is no longer a geographic location. If Israel is no longer a geographic location and the people are no longer a race of people, but they are people who are identified by spiritual characteristics, you have to do the same with the other nations. Egypt, Babylon, whatever other nations are mentioned in the prophecies and are applied in our time, you can't make them geographic or political locations. So there needs to be a kind of consistency when we come to the prophecies. Sometimes we will get it wrong, but the thing is, if we are consistent, most of the time we can depend on the solutions that we find. Because the thing is, one thing we can be sure, and it is that God is consistent. God is consistent. If there is uncertainty and inconsistency, something is wrong with our pattern of interpretation. And that's all right. But as long as we know, we can go back and do a recap, and we can revise and see if we can come up with a better approach. But if we get the right approach, that's the key. If we get the right approach, there will be consistency, because God is a master teacher. When God puts a code in the Bible, there are no mistakes in it. You know, it's like DNA, the DNA in your body. You know, it's interesting that the scientists talk about there was some parts of the DNA that are considered to be junk DNA, right? Because they don't see that it has any function. And now with a little bit more understanding, they are withdrawing their words. There's no junk DNA. It's just that they didn't understand the function of these parts of the DNA. God doesn't make mistakes. God is beyond imagination in his wisdom and his perfection and his precision and harmony. And it's the same thing with the Bible, same thing with the Word of God, same thing with the prophecies. when we can, when we have put our finger on God's pattern of interpretation, there is consistency. So anyway, because of this, we can. Well, I'll say one other thing in a general way. We're going to come to it in chapter 8. But one of the things that I want to reinforce is that the passages of Daniel 2, 7, the prophecy of 8, 9, 10, 11, and the prophecy of chapter 12. 8 and then 10 to 12. All of these prophecies, they cover the same ground. They cover the same ground. It's not four different prophetic times, right? Why do I say this? Because most people who come to interpret the book of Daniel, they say Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. They talk about the four kingdoms. And you can trace the pattern of those four kingdoms right down to the end. But they say when you come to chapter 8, it's dealing with a different period of time. It's dealing with the history of the Jews in the time of the Greeks. And the main villain in chapter 8 is a man called Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what they say about Daniel chapter 8. And this is kind of strange because Antiochus Epiphanes does not, the Greek kingdom is not highlighted in chapter 2 or chapter 7. The real enemy that is highlighted is the fourth kingdom and the little horn. Those are the enemies of God's people in the end of time. So chapter 8, it's inconsistent for chapter 8 to suddenly stop dealing with the end time and it goes back into history, into the time of the Greek Empire. It doesn't make sense. Chapter 8 would be completely out of sync with the rest of the book because the rest of the book, in all of the prophecies, chapter 2, chapter 7, chapters 10 to 12, the climax is the coming of Jesus in all of those prophecies. Chapter 8, why would it be different? Why would chapter 8 be talking about an Old Testament fulfillment when all the others are talking about an end of time fulfillment? It's like chapter 8 doesn't belong among those prophecies of Daniel. But the truth is it does. And so we have to bear this in mind as we look at it. Now, I'm kind of talking in a vacuum for some people I know because I'm talking about things we haven't come to yet. But having said it, I think when we come to it, you might be better able to process what I'm trying to say when we actually come to that point in the prophecy. But all right, let's actually go to the Bible itself now so we can get our teeth into something concrete. Let me get my Bible up. Okay. Daniel chapter 8. It says in verse 1, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. It's interesting that Daniel makes reference here to the previous prophecy. Let me see, in chapter 7, yeah, he says that the vision he had in chapter 7 was in the first year of Belshazzar. 2 years later, he has another vision in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So there was not a huge gap between these two visions, but it was big enough because 2 years is a long time. So the first one was in the first year. That's Daniel's first vision of note. And the second one here now is in the third year of Belshazzar. A vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw, that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. So it seems he was, Daniel was a servant of the state. So in his duties, he went from place to place. So I think by this time, no, this was the time of Belshazzar. Belshazzar didn't even know Daniel. So, but apparently, Daniel still had duties that allowed him to move around in the palace, because he was actually at the palace in Shushan when he had this vision. And in the vision, he was by the river Ulai. He was standing by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Now, we don't have to ask, what does this symbol represent? Because if you go further down in the chapter, it tells you clearly. It says, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So, there doesn't need to be any speculation about what these two symbols that we're going to be looking at, what they represent, because the meaning is right there. The explanation is given by an angel. All right, now, just something of interest here. It says the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn is the first king. So, what are we talking about? Is the goat the king, or is the horn the king? Well, obviously, when it says the rough goat is a king, it means the kingdom. Kingdom. Remember, we looked at this. We saw that many times the word king is used, and it really means kingdom or empire. The rough goat represents the empire of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes represents the first king of Greece. Earlier on, we had said that a horn represents a lesser kingdom. Now I'm going to, based on what happens in this chapter, I'm going to modify that a little bit and say that sometimes it seems like a horn also represents an individual king, based on how the messenger interprets this. It says the great horn that you see on the rough goat represents the first king of the kingdom of Greece. So obviously, a horn can represent a lesser kingdom, or it can represent the king of a lesser kingdom, or the king of a kingdom. All right? We'll discuss that a little bit more when we come back to that point. But let's go back up and having established that, let's look at these symbols here now. It says that the ram had two horns. One was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I think last week we took a little time, or it might have been the week before, to focus on the nature of the Medo-Persian kingdom, the Medo-Persian empire. It was made up of two nations, the Medes and the Persians. The more dominant or the more powerful nation was the Persian kingdom. Most of the time when you look at that empire in history, it's referred to as a Persian empire. But it was actually a combination of the Medes and the Persians. And the explanation of this is that both empires were related by family kinship. Darius the Mede was actually the king who became the first king. He was the king of the Medes. Cyrus the Persian was the king of the greater empire, but because Darius was his uncle, he gave him the preference in the throne. So when the Medo-Persian empire conquered the world, Darius was the first king. So the Median empire was more dominant at first because their king was the king. So this is what the Bible means when it says one was higher than the other, but the higher one came up last. After the death of Darius, then Cyrus became king and the Persian empire gained the ascendancy or became more dominant. It says, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. I suppose we can assume, when it says that this ram is pushing westward, northward, and southward, it's clear that this ram is coming from the east. And I mean, for those of us who are interested in geography, it's helpful information because we can know that relative to where Daniel was, relative to the perspective of Daniel, the Medo-Persian Empire came from the east. So it pushes to the west, it pushes north, it pushes to the south. It's coming from the east. No beast might stand before him, meaning that there was no other kingdom, no other empire that could stand before it. It says he did according to his will and became great. So this is God's way of describing the Medo-Persian Empire in this particular prophecy. We already saw in Daniel 2 this empire represented as the breast and the arms of silver. In the second prophecy, we saw it represented as a bear that rose up on one side and had 3 ribs in the mouth. Now, the question might be asked, why is it that in this particular prophecy, the prophecy begins with Medo-Persia? Why doesn't it begin with Babylon? Because chapter 2 and chapter 5 talk about the Babylonian Empire as the first empire. But I accept the explanation. I've seen this explanation. It makes sense to me that God does not focus on Babylon anymore because Babylon is nearly at an end. It has no more place in history because this is the 3rd year of Belshazzar, and Babylon is shortly to be overthrown. So in this particular prophecy, God does not mention Babylon. There's no symbol for Babylon. He begins with the next dominant empire, which is Medo-Persia. So there's no mention of Babylon here. So it says this beast became great. So that is a description of the Medo-Persian Empire. But it goes on to say, and as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth. Now, it says that this beast was pushing westward, northward, and southward. And obviously, from in front of it, there comes a he-goat from the west. And geographically, I think you'll find that Greece was to the west of Persia. So the he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. Obviously, God is trying to show us that this beast is coming with such speed and such ferocity. I mean, even in cartoons, one of the ways that cartoonists will demonstrate somebody moving at great speed, they draw their feet off the ground. So that's a symbol that is used universally to represent great speed. The goat was moving so fast, it barely touched the ground, or his feet didn't appear to touch the ground. So, as we already discussed, this was one of the primary characteristics of the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great conquered the world in 5 years, the world as it was then known. And in that time, it was an extremely remarkable feat to do this. So that God represents this goat as coming very fast. And the goat had a notable horn between its eyes. This notable horn, of course, we just read it was the first king. And obviously that king represents Alexander. History labels this man as Alexander the Great. This tells you the kind of respect and admiration that worldly people have for the kind of prowess that this man demonstrated as a warrior. And God even here alludes to that when he says that the goat had a notable horn. So it is God here contributing to the idea that Alexander the Great was an outstanding warrior as far as the world is concerned. It says, he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him. The word choler here means simply anger, wrath, fury. He was moved with fury against him, and smote the ram, brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. So, what I find very interesting is how, in a few brief words, God gives you a graphic description of what happened. He gives it to us using a symbol, but the symbol is You can't escape what is happening. The he-goat comes against the ram, breaks his two horns, and he destroys him. He throws him down to the ground, stamps upon him, and nobody can deliver him out of the hand of the he-goat. Remember that it says that this ram became great. And now the he-goat comes against him and completely devastates him and destroys him. You don't have to go to history and study about the conflicts between the Medes and the Persians and the battle of this and the battle of that. In this brief image, God has put a picture in your mind that you can forever know the history of the conflict between the Medes and the Persians and the kingdom of Greece. You know exactly what happened. The Greek kingdom under Alexander the Great completely devastated the Medes and the Persians and destroyed their power entirely. They not only destroyed their power, but they completely wiped out their potential for recovery. They stamped upon the goat stamped upon the ram, and there was found nobody who could deliver him out of his hand. It goes on to say in verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. Now again, I want to point out that there are these little words, and I don't think it is prudent to ignore little things. I don't read Greek and Hebrew, so in most cases it takes me some time to go and look up words that maybe unusual, but it seems significant. I've seen comments on this and I believe it. It says that the ram became great. It says that the he-goat became very great. And later we're going to see a little further down that it says that something became exceeding great. The next power that is described, it says exceeding great. So there is, when I was in school, I learned, how you work with degrees. You have positive, comparative, and superlative, right? You had a positive, the ram became great. The next one became very great, and then the third one became most great, exceeding great. You can't avoid the conclusion as you are looking at what is happening in this chapter that God is taking you through the concept of ever increasing greatness among these empires that we are looking at. That is important. If you look at the previous prophecies, the first prophecy, God showed you the magnificence of these kingdoms. Babylon was gold, Medo-Persia was silver, Greece was brass, Rome was iron. What you could notice is that as you move down that image, it became inferior in terms of magnificence and riches. But it became greater in terms of power, because I believe silver is tougher than gold, and I believe brass is tougher than silver, and I believe iron is tougher than all of them. So among those four empires, the empires kept getting progressively tougher, stronger. Something similar with the well, it's not exactly the same way with the animals. You have the lion, then the bear, then the leopard. So it doesn't grow increasingly stronger, or that symbolism isn't used in the second prophecy. But surely number 4 is the strongest of all. The great and terrible beast is the strongest. Here in chapter 8, we have a very clear delineation of increasing greatness. Great, very great, and exceeding great. God is trying to tell us something. So it says in verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it, or instead of it, came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now I'm kind of like in a little bit of a toss-up here, because when it says the great horn was broken, I've always said that this great horn was Alexander the Great. But I'm thinking a little bit here now. I'm wondering, it could be another way of saying that Greece was under one unified kingdom, because the Greece Empire was actually dominated by the Greek kingdom. The Greek Empire embraced the domain, it went as far as India. It embraced other kingdoms, but it was the Greek Empire dominated by the nation of Greece. But that nation was divided up into four. Now, anyway, it's not really critical. It might be critical later in terms of how we interpret the symbols. But anyway, let's stay with that. It's just a little question in my mind that I would want to further look at in just a moment. But if this great horn is Alexander, then the four that came up towards the four winds of heaven would also need to represent four individuals, four men. And it has been said that these four represented the four generals of Alexander's army: Cassander, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus. Those were the names of Alexander's four generals. And when Alexander died, as we pointed out, he died in a drunken fit one night. He drank the cup of Hercules 5 times. I forget how many quarts it contained. He drank the cup of Hercules full of liquor. Either he drank it with five quarts, or he drank a lesser amount 5 times. I can't remember which it was. But anyway, he got into a drunken fit, got into a fever, and died 3 days later. And since he had no heir, the Greek kingdom was divided up among the four generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And so it says that instead of the one horn, there came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. But this is what makes me think a little, because when it says four notable ones came up, it seems to be referring more to four smaller kingdoms rather than four individuals. And I'm going to show you why. It's saying that Greece was divided into four smaller kingdoms. So, to be consistent, if the four horns represent four smaller kingdoms, then the one horn should not be used to represent an individual. So it's just something in my mind I'm going to be looking at a little more closely. Because when you look at verse 9, look at verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. Out of one of what? It says there came up four notable horns toward the four winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. So, if this is referring to one of the four horns, out of one of the four horns, there comes another little horn. Then it would mean that either Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, or Ptolemy had a child who is represented by this little horn. And there's nothing in history that suggests that anything like this would fulfill this prophecy. All right, now let's stick with the interpretation, the traditional interpretation, and see where we end up. It says, out of one of them came forth a little horn. Some people suggest that when it says out of one of them, it means out of one of the four winds of heaven. I'm going to stop at this moment and explain a little problem. Here's a little problem that is presented. The next power that we are looking for is the power that appears after Greece. If you look at the other two prophecies, you have Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and then Rome, of course. The next power is Rome. So if this prophecy is parallel to the other prophecies, then you have Medo Persia, you have Greece. What appears next? It should be Rome. But it says that a little horn comes out of one of the four. And a lot of people argue that Rome never came out of the Grecian Empire. It never came out of Greece. The kingdom of Rome never came out of the Greek Empire. It never came out of the kingdom of Lysimachus or Seleucus or Ptolemy or Cassander. Yeah, it never came out of any of those. So they say this could not be referring to Rome. It's referring to something that came out of the Greek Empire. So some people say, well, it probably is speaking about the four winds. Out of one of the four winds, there came forth a little horn, which became very great. And if this is true, it would more readily fit the description of Rome. So I'm going to share that point of view with all of us. If you don't understand what I just said, please stop me. I'm trying my best to not be confusing. But if you don't understand, please let me know that you don't understand. And to let you know why I'm doing this, the problem is that we expect the next kingdom to be Rome, but Rome did not come out of one of the four horns. At least history tells us that Rome came from Europe, and the four divisions of the Greek Empire did not include that part of Europe where Rome was. So some people are suggesting that when it says out of one of them came forth a little horn, it means out of one of the four winds of heaven. Out of one of those directions there came a little horn. And that would fit Rome. Because Rome must have come from either east, west, north, or south. It actually came from the west. So, why do we say that this horn represents Rome? It has to be. Why? Because this little horn waxed exceeding great. Now, people who disagree, they say that this little horn was a Greek king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. I mentioned him already. They say that this Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes became the enemy of the Jews. He offered swine's blood, pig's blood on the Jewish altar. He so outraged the Jews that they actually made rebellion and made war against him. Two Jewish brothers by the name of Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus and his brother, they raised armies and they fought guerrilla warfare against the Greeks until they actually defeated them and overthrew overturned the Greek atrocities. They put an end to it. And the history of that is in the book of Maccabees, of course. But anyway, so there is this, if you read most interpretations of Daniel 8, apart from Seventh-day Adventist interpretations, they will tell you that this little horn represents Antiochus Epiphanes. And you will read the same interpretation from many Adventists. You know that there are many Adventists who they have a great problem with the idea of the 2300 days applying to the end of time. I'm not defending Adventism, okay, because I want to defend the Bible. I don't want to say I am taking a position because it's an Adventist position. You all know I try very hard not to be like this because I don't want to be biased. But at the same time, I'm not throwing out an Adventist interpretation if it makes sense. I'm not throwing it out. In Jamaica, they will say you swap a monkey for a black dog. I'm not swapping a monkey for a black dog. I'm not throwing away something that makes sense just because other people say it's not so. I have to study it from the Bible. And if you're giving me something, give me something that makes more sense. Don't give me something that doesn't make more sense. Whatever power follows the goat, it became exceeding great. You know what they call Antiochus? They call his name was Antiochus Epiphanes. They call him Antiochus Epimanes. It means Antiochus the madman. He was not respected in history. He was not rated as a great king. He did not become exceeding great. This does not apply to Antiochus Epiphanes. And when we look at the rest of it, you're going to see clearly it's not Antiochus Epiphanes. Some of the ways they have to distort and twist it. It's very interesting. Which is why I mentioned, a lot of people who have been Adventists or they are still Adventists, but they have a problem with the interpretation of the 2300 days. There are some aspects of that interpretation that I have had to modify and adjust, in terms of what happened in 1844. They say it was the beginning of the Day of Atonement and all of that, and I do have some modified ideas about that. But at the same time, these people, when you look at how they interpret the rest of the passage, I'm going to comment on it as we go down. There is some convoluted twisting of the words that is involved that is amazing. It's really swapping a monkey for a black dog. You end up with something worse than the thing you are throwing away. And that is not something that honest people should do. So it says a little horn comes out of, whether it's the four winds or out of the Greek Empire. One thing I'm pretty certain of is that this little horn is referring to the kingdom of Rome. Because one thing is that this little horn is greater than the goat. And it's greater than the ram. The ram was great, the goat was very great, and the little horn becomes exceeding great. It's a greater power. It's simple. You look at Daniel 2, you look at Daniel 7, what is the next great power? It's Rome. So if something comes up after Greece that is exceeding great, obviously it's Rome. We don't have to go through too many mental gymnastics to come to that conclusion. We just simply have to compare the prophecies with one another. Now, I think I'm going to bring up, well, all right, I'll wait. I won't do that. I'm going to bring up a graphic. One second. Yes, I hear you, brother. Brother Steve, is it? Or is it brother Patrick?
Brother Steve.
Yes, brother Steve.
Concerning that little horn, in relation to, or comparing it with the fourth beast of Daniel 7, I'm getting an impression that you have a great and terrible beast that, God had to make up to represent Rome. And here we have a little horn representing Rome, even though exceeding great describes it. But the contrast is so great, as I see, in terms of its appearance. What do you think about that?
I agree with you, brother Steve. I agree with the initial idea, but if you look at it talks about the growth of this little horn because the little horn, it's little when it appears. There came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great. What we can gather from reading the description is that even though it starts out little, it grows, and it grows to such a place that it becomes no longer a little horn, because it says it waxed great even to the host of heaven. It extends its reach, and it reaches beyond a little horn by far. The second thing I want to say in that regard is in Daniel 2, God represents the empires of the world as wild beasts. In Daniel 7, in Daniel 2, he represents the empires of the world as metals in an image. But when you come to Daniel 8, how does he represent them? Not as wild beasts. In other words, his emphasis here in Daniel 8 is not on the wild beast nature of these empires. There's something else that is being emphasized in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8. And maybe using your question as a starting point, it's a good opportunity for me to point out something. There is a reason why God gives the same prophecy 4 times, or there's more than one reason. We already mentioned that he does it 4 times because in each prophecy, in each succeeding prophecy, he gives more detail, greater detail. Our understanding develops as we go through the prophecy, second time, third time, fourth time. However, there's something else, something that is very significant. In each of these prophecies, God is showing us history, the history of his people, the history of the world from 4 different points of view, 4 different perspectives. If you look at prophecy number 1, he's looking at the history of the world from a geographic point of view. Well, I can't just say it like that. I can't just say it like that. To understand what I'm trying to say, look at what had happened to Israel. Look at what had happened to physical Israel. They had lost the kingdom. And God uses this as a way to kind of introduce us to the restoration of a greater kingdom at the end of time. Now think about what it involved when they lost the kingdom. They lost their what is the word? They lost their geographic kingdom. All right, they lost their land, their holy land. Secondly, they lost their king. They lost their monarchy. Thirdly, they lost their religious system. That was an integral part of the kingdom. And fourthly, they lost the people. They lost their demographics. Okay, all four of those things make up a kingdom. You can't have a kingdom without people. You can't have a kingdom without a system of worship. You can't have a kingdom without a king, a monarchy. And you can't have a kingdom without a place to rule. Israel lost all of these. When you look at the book of Daniel, God is showing you the restoration of the geography. Daniel 2, a stone becomes a mountain and fills the whole earth. It destroys all the kingdoms of this world. And it's made up of metals. It's pointing to land. A place where you can live. Daniel 2 is talking about the monarchy. The Son of Man receives a kingdom, and he's to be king forever and ever. Daniel 8 is talking about the worship of the kingdom, and that's an important point. And so this is why when you look at the animals in Daniel 8, they are animals associated with the worship of the sanctuary. God is not showing us wild beasts anymore. He's not focusing on the voracious nature of these kingdoms. He's focusing on their interaction and their relation towards the worship system of his people. And of course, Daniel 10, 11, and 12 is the most literalistic of all the prophecies, and it ends with the restoration of the people. At that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So the four lines of prophecy have to do with the four areas of restoration of the kingdom. So I'm just saying this, Brother Steve, to point out one of the reasons why the symbolism of ferocity that we see in Daniel 7 is not necessarily there in this description of the fourth horn, of the little horn, of the little horn that becomes exceedingly great. One of the things that is most striking about this little horn is the work that it does, and we're going to look at that in just a moment, right? Because I understand the point that you were making, but when we look at what this little horn does, to try to apply this to Antiochus Epiphanes or to anybody else, in my opinion, is really stretching it very far. So let's look at what it means, what it says. It says that this little horn waxed great even to the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. What does this mean? Because there is no power on earth that can reach up to heaven and throw down the host of heaven. So, of course, God must be speaking in a figurative way. So we would ask, who would be recognized as the host and of the stars of heaven? And the best conclusion I can come to, it must be talking about luminaries. It must be talking about outstanding people among the people of God. I can't think of any other explanation. All right, because unless it's talking about Satan himself, because it says Satan's tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven back there in Revelation. But this is clearly not speaking of Satan. Satan is not the little horn. So I have to think that this is applying to whoever this little horn is. Let's say that at the moment. Let's describe it this way. This little horn, it does a work of destruction in destroying especially people who are prominent among the people of God. And this could apply to anybody. It could apply to Antiochus Epiphanes. It could apply to Rome, and even to other. even to other entities. You're saying, Brother Matt?
Yeah, can I offer a suggestion?
Please.
That it may be talking about religious leaders because it's in the sanctuary context, in the context of the sanctuary and the religious system. Maybe it's
I
talking
think
about religious leaders.
I think so, Brother Matt. I think so. The thing is that this fourth chapter of Daniel, once you understand that it is focusing on worship, it becomes easier to fit it with chapter 2 and chapter 7 and to understand why the symbolism is so different. Now, verse 11 is really the verse that is, to me, is most telling. It says, Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. This phrase here, the prince of the host, for those who say it refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, they say that the prince of the host here is referring to some leader among the Jews, some religious leader, might have been the high priest, I think they say. In context, brothers and sisters, I don't think this makes any sense. You mean that it is saying that Antiochus Epiphanes magnified or exalted himself to the place of the prince of the host? This phrase appears in the book of Daniel several times. As a matter of fact, I'm going to look at the phrase, the word, the prince. I'm going to ask us to just look at it here in the book of Daniel. And we are going to see that once you do this, it becomes very clear that this word is used in a very specialized sense in the book of Daniel. And it doesn't mean the high priest. There's no place that the phrase the prince of the host is used to refer to the high priest anywhere in the Bible. If we say it refers to a king, a Jewish king, it might make more sense. But then you couldn't say that Antiochus magnified himself to the place of the Jewish king because they didn't have a king for one. And number two, Antiochus didn't magnify himself to the place of the Jewish king. The Jews were subjugated by the Greeks. He was above the Jewish king. He didn't need to magnify himself to get to that place. Look at the word prince in the book of Daniel. I'm going to look at every place that it appears. It says that it says that the king Nebuchadnezzar took some of the princes, referring to Daniel and his friends, right? Daniel 1 verse 3. Daniel 1 verse 7, it says, the prince of the eunuch gave them names. And the prince of the eunuch here refers to the one who is in charge of the eunuchs. Same thing in verse 8. Same thing in verse 9, the prince of the eunuchs. Verse 10, 11. All of them in chapter 1 are basically referring to the same thing. In Daniel 3 and verse 2, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king sent together the princes. He means the royalty. In As a matter of fact, instead of going through all of it, let me just get straight to my point. There is somebody in the book of Daniel who is called the prince in the same chapter 8. Look at what it says in chapter 8. This is the same chapter that we are looking at. And it's referring to the same thing that we just read. Look at what it says. Through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, that same little horn. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace he shall destroy many. Look what it says next. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. Who does this refer to? Who would God refer to as the prince of princes? I mean, king of kings is one label, but who is referred to as the prince of princes?
Jesus.
I really can't imagine that the Bible would describe anybody else as the prince of princes apart from Jesus. And if you go on to look at some of the descriptions that are given in chapter 9, for example, in chapter 9, this is a word that is used, this is a phrase that is used, a word that is used to describe Jesus or to refer to Jesus. Um, for example, in Daniel 9, when he talks about the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, Look at what it says. Know therefore and understand, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince. God describes Jesus here as the Prince. He's referred to as the Messiah, the Prince. If Jesus is referred to as the Prince in the Bible, and for those of you who believe in this particular identity, in Daniel 12 and verse 1 it says, at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. Now I know there are some people who do not believe that Michael is the name of Jesus in his pre-incarnation, but I think that the biblical evidence is very strong. I'm not going to discuss it this evening, but at the same time, he is referred to as the great prince who stands for the people of God. And the great prince who stands for the people of God is Jesus Christ. In another place, oh yes, here it says that it refers to him in Daniel 8 as the prince of princes. He shall stand up against the prince of princes. There's nobody else who carries this kind of title. So anyway, I'm saying this because I'm really trying to emphasize the point why I really can't accept that this person here represents Antiochus Epiphanes. And the more you look at the description of what the horn does, the more it grows on you that it can only be speaking about Rome in two forms. Rome, it starts out as Rome, the pagan entity, and it morphs into Rome, the religious expression of that entity. It's not strange because when you go to Daniel chapter 7, you find that the great beast has a little horn on its head. Papal Rome was a part of the Roman Empire and had a great influence on what was going on there. So if in Daniel 8, both are represented under one emblem, it's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising. All right, look at what it says. Let's go back to verse 11. He magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now, you have to ask the question, are we speaking about a literal sanctuary? Are we talking about a literal sacrifice? And if so, are we talking about the literal prince of the host? Are we talking about an earthly high priest? Are we talking about an earthly dignitary? Or are we talking about the greater one? As I said, every one of the prophecies of Daniel focuses on the end time events, beginning with the atrocities of Rome against God's people. It's very out of sync, out of harmony with the book, if this is talking about something else. So anyway, he magnifies himself to the prince of the host. This is easily understood if you understand that the papacy has arrogated to itself the prerogatives of Jesus Christ. That's not difficult to understand. There are clearly established historical documents and statements where the Pope has claimed that he is Christ's representative on earth, who has all the power and authority of Jesus Christ to make decisions and to speak and to do all the things that Jesus Christ, that are unique to Jesus Christ. Now you might say, well, don't we as Christians have the authority of Jesus? And I will say yes, but notice something. In the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, you and I don't have that power. The ordinary Catholic does not have this power. In the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, it is exclusively the Pope who has this authority and power. So he's not speaking about the power and authority given to God's people. He's speaking about the power and authority given to the Pope, that the Pope has taken unto himself to sit in the place of Christ. Not only to exercise the authority and power of Christ, but to actually receive the worship and the adulation which are due to Christ. It goes on to say, by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Now let's think for a moment. What is the daily sacrifice? The word sacrifice is a supplied word. All right, it's in italics. It's not in the original. It just simply says, by him the daily was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. But the daily, which can be translated as a continual, it kind of seems very obvious that it's speaking about the sacrifice, because there was a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice. It happened every day. Everything is being given to us in the language of the sanctuary service, because remember what I said a little earlier. These animals, the ram and the he-goat, they are sanctuary animals, because what is being focused on in this chapter is worship. But remember, what was taken away from Israel was their sanctuary and their services of worship, and their people and their land, and everything was taken away. And God comes to them in the book of Daniel, in the prophecies of Daniel, and God is telling them about restoration. However, while the Jews are thinking about physical restoration of their physical sanctuary, their physical worship, God has something much greater in mind. God is talking about the far greater end time restoration of all things. That's what we see in chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 12 and 11. Chapter 8 cannot be out of sync, otherwise it doesn't belong in the book of Daniel. I hope what I'm trying to say is understandable. This alone is reason for me to say this is speaking about an end time or our last days scenario. How would the little horn take away the daily sacrifice? Well, listen, for nearly 1500 years, how did the Christian world come to God? Was it through the mediation of Jesus Christ? No, it was through the papacy, through the Pope. The vast majority of the Christian world for 1500 years knew nothing about Jesus as their mediator. We might marvel today when we think that Martin Luther's message was justification by faith. When Martin Luther was crawling up on his knees upon Pilate's staircase in Rome, and he seemed to hear a voice like thunder that said, "The just shall live by faith." And he leaped to his feet and he hurried away. You think Martin Luther was in such darkness. But what we have to understand is that Martin Luther's position was the default position of almost everybody of that day. How did it get to this place? The little horn took away the daily sacrifice, or it took away the knowledge of Christ's mediatorial work. When it says that the daily sacrifice was taken away, you can never imagine that somebody can reach up to heaven and take down Christ out of his place. But if the work of Jesus becomes null and void as far as people are concerned, if you don't know about it, if it is no good to you, if you are not benefiting from it, then it's just the same as if it had never happened. You block Jesus from the people, and what you have done is take away the work of Jesus. The place of his sanctuary is cast down. If you apply this in the New Testament sense, to take away the place of Jesus' sanctuary is to obscure the reality of the work and the place of Jesus in terms of our worship and our relationship with God. And history demonstrates with great clarity that this was the work of the Roman Catholic Church. And as a matter of fact, even today, today I see your brother Matt, even today, Catholics are beginning to open up. They have opened up so that Catholics are told to read their Bibles. But they honestly, there's no need for them to read it with any seriousness. I have never met a Catholic. I don't meet a lot of them, so maybe I shouldn't say. But I've never encountered in my studies trying to read documents, I've never encountered a document by a Catholic that makes me believe that they are careful and deep Bible students. If you want to be really amazed one day, go to a Catholic interpretation of the book of Revelation. And I say amazed because I want to be respectful, right? because I was about to say if you want to die laughing. But anyway, go ahead, Brother Matt. You wanted to say something, Brother Matt?
Yeah, as soon as I'm done laughing, my my son got these glasses. It's kind of like what you say. My son got these glasses from his aunt for his birthday. They make everything upside down, and I'm thinking that's what it's going to happen to you if you read the Catholic Book of Revelation. Anyway, but
You-
I was bursting in my mind because of all the things that you've been saying. We had a little talk about this a couple weeks ago, and all these things are running through my mind about how the system had torn down all of the representations of articles of furniture to mean something else or to lessen them to a great degree, so you couldn't understand what their purpose pointing to this plan of salvation. And just like you spoke about all these things that they uh, distorted. Um, and then I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but yeah, it's very exciting to understand these things clearly.
Okay, thank you, Brother Matt. Um, now, verse 11. I kind
Brother,
of agree that if
Brother
you
David,
interpret, yes, Sister Di.
I don't want you to get ahead. I was looking at this. I have a question because I was looking at this afternoon, um, and I found in this book I have from AD 100 all the way up to 1990, the different uh, peoples did, uh, from Josephus down to uh, Wheeling. So it goes through 14, 15, 16, a bunch of people, right? And I guess these are scholars of sorts. You know, it even lists Adventist, Crozier, Uriah Smith, Bell, Haskell, Jones, Bunch, Smith, Ford. But my question is the question about the daily. Because if the word sacrifice, should we, because the word is added, is a supply word, should we even read it with the word because it implies something? So then if you take the word daily out, what does it mean? And it's interesting because of all the different interpretations down through the years that these people were saying the daily was. And then it gets to the point where I'm going to say about nickel. Well, no, a guy named Broadside Campbell. They were starting about 1837. They were saying it was pagan Rome. But then there was others who back in 1566 would call it the true gospel, the pure worship of God, the true worship of God and Jesus, true worship, true worship, true worship. So a lot of these guys were calling it true worship, but some of them put it, and Wheeling said perpetual Sabbath. So what is the daily, removing the word sacrifice?
All right. This is a perpetual contention in Adventism because some of Adventist pioneers insisted that the daily represented paganism. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people say if we are true, there is a continual debate in Adventist circles, and usually, to be honest, it's in the periphery of Adventists, right? Those who I heard when I just started to look at this that Ellen White said that the daily was paganism. Later on, when I got more information, they said that she said something else. Then another time, somebody else said that she said something else. I mean, I got to the place where I realized you can't determine what is true by Adventist history or by anybody else's history. Okay, it's kind of silly for us to be taking our cues from people like Augustine or even Josephus or anybody else. The best way is to look at the context of what is being said. Now, I started out by being very strictly historical Adventists. And so a lot of what they said, it meant a lot to me. But I became, and I believe my endeavor is to be strictly biblical Christian. That's my bottom line. So I don't care about anything else. So if you look at this now, let's put in the word paganism. I'm going to read these verses and I'm going to put in paganism and see how much sense it makes, okay? Yes, he, the little horn, an enemy of God's people, magnified himself as far as the prince of the host, which is one of God's people, or Jesus, as I believe. And by him, the little horn, paganism was taken away, and the sanctuary of paganism was cast down. And an army was given to this little horn against paganism because of the transgression of this little horn. And this little horn cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. First of all, you find that as you read the verse this way, you find that there is a lack of consistency in the subject. When you're reading something, for it to make sense, the subject needs to be consistent because it seems to be talking about an attack against paganism and an attack against God's people in the same breath. It's making out that the little horn is doing something bad. And one of those bad things is that it is attacking paganism as well as attacking God's people. Both things are being spoken of in the same breath, and it does not make reasonable sense nor logical sense. This is not how we find the scripture written. But more than this, let's go a little further. Let's go a little further. In verses 13, I know I'm jumping ahead of myself. And I promise you that those of you who are a little lost because of the question, I promise you that we are going to go over this in detail. All right, I'm just trying to answer the question because of Sister Diane's question. I want to just clarify this for those of you who are able to follow. It says, then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which speak, how long shall be the vision concerning paganism? Let's put paganism in there again. How long shall be the vision concerning paganism and the transgression of desolation, to give the sanctuary and the army to be trodden underfoot? Where does paganism come into this? How long shall be the vision concerning paganism and the transgression of desolation? It makes more sense to say, how long shall be the vision concerning the casting down of Jesus' ministry by the transgression of desolation, to give the sanctuary of Jesus and the people of Jesus to be trodden underfoot? Look what it says next. This is the key. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. What is the issue in all of this? It's the cleansing of the sanctuary. It's the sanctuary of Jesus Christ that has been trodden underfoot. It's not about paganism. It's not about something being taken out of the way to make way for something else. It's about a work that paganism, a work that the little horn is doing. It's about a work the little horn is doing to attack. It's an attack against the cause of God, against something called the daily, an attack against the sanctuary, an attack against the host, an attack against the sanctuary. This is what is happening, and the question is asked, how long will this little horn be allowed to do this? Like I say, we will come back to that and look at everything in more detail. Probably we
Okay,
won't.
so just let me be clear. So the guys that are saying pure worship, true worship of God, the true worship, Christ's ministry, true worship, Christ's ministry, Christ's service in heaven, Christ's ministry in heaven, they're on in line with what the daily is.
I
You
believe
think
so. I believe so.
using that term as opposed to these other ones that are saying pagan Rome, paganism, stuff like that.
Yes, Sister Di, and I'm glad that I have A.T. Jones in my corner.
Yeah, he says Christ's service in heaven. Bunch
Yeah.
says Christ's ministry in heaven.
I am with A.T. Jones.
Okay. All
Um,
right. Thank you. I
okay.
was interesting because this was I was looking at this afternoon and I was trying to figure it out who was right.
There are a few other places as well. If you look at Daniel 9, for example, let me show you something else. Look at Daniel 9 and verse 27, where you have similar language being used. Just look at this. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Now, it's not talking about the same exact thing, but this idea comes up several places in the book of Daniel about him taking away the daily, and usually they add the word sacrifice, but it talks about the daily. This connection between something being taken away in connection with the sacrifice, in the connection with the abomination of desolation. It appears about 4 times in the book of Daniel. So if you miss what it means in one place, you can compare it to the other places, and you can see it really is talking about the word sacrifice is a fitting word, even though the translators added the word. It's not everything that they add that is a faulty addition. In this case, I believe the addition was correct. The daily sacrifice was taken away because we are being given Old Testament language and Old Testament imagery. A lamb, a he-goat, a sanctuary, the prince of the host of heaven. It's language of the Old Testament, but we have to translate the meaning because it is applied in our age. We have to transfer this into the understanding of the New Testament. And the daily, there is no place in the Bible, no hint of anywhere in the Bible where the term daily, continual, refers to paganism. No place. I mean, this understanding, it was just, in my opinion, something that was forced into the text to fit the meaning that some people wanted to give to the text. It almost takes a genius to begin to think that way because there's nothing in the passage, nothing in the context that would lead anybody to that kind of conclusion.
So, just for the sake of the question, so use the term paganism, pagan Rome, or paganism. They're just making the 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 case that papacy came in, paganism of Rome switched over. They're making a distinction in that case, but that's not what the text is talking about.
Absolutely. They are trying to say that what the text is saying that they say it's talking about the history of the papacy. A host
Mm,
was given to the papacy to overthrow paganism in order
mm,
that the papacy could be established. So the daily that was taken away was paganism, and it was taken out of the way, and then the papacy was established. But the entire context of the passage is talking about an assault by the little horn upon the cause of God. And the question at the end makes it clear, you know. But we have to leave the rest of it until next week. But we can discuss the issue a little bit more. But I'm not going to go further in the actual perusal of the verses until next week. But I just want to show you one other thing that makes us understand what this is talking about. Because in verse 17 it says, "So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." This vision is an end time vision. It does not apply in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So, whatever interpretation we give to these symbols, we have to use New Testament interpretation of the symbols. So that's maybe the last point that I would make concerning this for
okay.
this evening.
Okay, so I want to make myself clear. I want to be clear. So, the fact that the papacy was taking something away from Christ, they were taking something away from Christ's ministry when they were coming into existence. And the idea is they were coming into existence, and at the same time something was happening with the ministry of Christ. And now that was being overshadowed by the fact that they were keeping something going on down here where the people couldn't look to the ministry of Christ. So now they're losing out on their salvation because instead of looking to the ministry of what Christ is doing, they've got them cast down to the ground here looking to them. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The worst thing the papacy ever did, it took Christ away from the people. In other words, to put it simply, the papacy took Christ away from the people. You know, people talk about the persecutions and the false teachings of Rome. ultimately the greatest harm ever done by the Church of Rome. Simply put, they took away Christ from the people.
Mm.
And that was the greatest tragedy ever perpetrated upon the Christian church by any power at all. And this was what had to be overturned.
Mhm.
David, I have a question when you can.
Yes, Brother Joel, go ahead. I think I'm just about going to stop and just take questions at this point.
Okay, the question has to do with something I heard you say earlier, and I got a little distracted here at home and missed, a very important point in my mind. You were making the point that Rome did not come out to these four generals of um, of Alexander. When I look at the history of it, though, and what I find interesting, it's that it wasn't just four people that were trying to rebuild what Alexander had left. But one of the main individuals, the person who actually had the greatest success outside of Seleucid, was Antigonus, who is completely left out of the conversation completely. That man ruled almost all of Turkey and took over almost of the Seleucidian Empire for a time before he died, and he's completely ignored. It's not just him; there are others as well. Now I understand why the Bible does say four horns, and I guess with him being one of the first to die, leaving the other four as then the main antagonist, I can understand that. But you made a statement about Rome not coming out of the four horns. What was the exact point you were trying to make? Because I missed that, and I thought that was an important point you were making.
Right. It's not my point. It's a point other people make. But I accept the reasoning. What they say is that the Grecian Empire never encompassed Rome. So to say that Rome came out of one of the four horns is not true to history. So they say that little horn, that other horn that came out, could not be Rome. It had to be a subset of Greece. So it had to be another Grecian king, and this is how they end up with Antiochus Epiphanes.
I
So,
understand that. How do you fix that, though, in terms of your understanding?
right, well, I can reason around it a little bit by saying that if Greece really was a global empire, then from somewhere within that empire, Rome had to emerge. So either it wasn't a global empire, or if it was, Greece had to arise from somewhere within that. But the other explanation that I proffered is what other people say, which also to me seems somewhat plausible, which is that when it says out of one of them arose another little horn, it is referring to out of one of the four winds. It says the four horns arose towards the four winds of heaven. Then immediately it says out of one of them arose another little horn. So the suggestion is that this other little horn did not come from one of the four horns. It came from one of the four winds.
That makes sense. Because, again, the other way it really doesn't historically, if you understand what was happening there, because they're right. When that area was divided up, Cassander had Macedonia, Lysimachus had Bulgaria, which was traced back then. Because I believe who are the other two? Ptolemy had Egypt, and Seleucus had over where the Arabs would have been, that section. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What you just said about the winds, that would probably explain it. All right, thank you, David.
Well, can you
Okay.
explain what the winds represent?
Say that again, Sister Celerina.
Can you explain then what the winds represent here?
Um, basically I understand the four winds to represent the four corners of the compass, the four corners of the compass. When it says towards the four winds of heaven, I mean the winds are used many times to represent strife and conflict among the nations, but usually when it says that there is a great whirlwind or the four winds are striving, what it means is that east, west, north, and south, there's a universal conflict. There's a great war among the nations, east, west, north, and south. So it says the four winds. But the primary meaning seems to be that the four winds represent the four directions of the compass.
Mm.
So when it says it's towards the four winds of heaven, it means the four directions of the compass. But
It,
brother Joel, brother Steve, I think it was who said Why then would you represent Rome as a little horn arising when Rome actually became greater than the other two previous kingdoms? But think it can be demonstrated that when Rome began to come to power, it was a small kingdom. It began to grow. It grew, but it was a small kingdom. As a matter of fact, they say that Rome was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus. They even have a fable that they were raised by a she-wolf, but it was just a small state, and it began to grow, and it exalted itself and became exceedingly great. So I think the Bible does give us that image of a progression in growth as it began to dominate and to take control. Um,
What allows for that, David, is the fact that they were distracted. After Alexander died, there was the War of the Diadochi, which is the War of the Successors, which were all his generals, and it wasn't just five of them; it was about six or seven that were fighting. We spend a lot of time speaking about the four, and I find it amazing that Antigonus again is left out because he was actually the one that came closest to bringing the whole thing back together just before he died. So you're right. In that time, Rome, which would have been at the time, in the big picture of things, an insignificant group of people based on what was happening with Alexander generals, had an opportunity to grow up, and they defeated the Macedonian king. That's where they started to get really a foothold within in terms of world power. But it's true. I can understand why it is the historians would look at it and say that Rome did not come out of the four generals, any of the four generals, because they did not. They were not
okay.
a territory that was ruled over. I understand what you're saying in terms of Alexander having, a great control at the time, but the area of Rome was not one of those areas that he would have had cemented total control when he was alive.
Um, I look forward to our discussion next week because as far as I'm concerned, I think the most important question is what are the spiritual implications of studying this chapter for me today? I'll tell you the truth. If this is about Antiochus Epiphanes, I don't even know if it makes sense for me to study it because it's history. But I believe the prophecies, the point of the prophecies is what is God saying to me today. And I believe that when you understand Daniel 8 from the perspective that I'm trying to get us to approach it, I think you see it has great relation not only to our lives today but to the messages on which we have been focusing, the message of Christ and his righteousness. It fits in place so beautifully that almost just on that basis alone, I would want to say this is the correct interpretation. Because one thing I'm sure of is that when we understand the prophecies, Jesus will be at the center of it. And that is what appeals to me about this kind of approach that I
Brother,
want us to take.
Brother Clayton.
Yes, Sister Lorena.
Um, you the verse about the daily. I just want to touch on that just one more time so that I can understand it because you were comparing it to what they said. Not sure who they were or what the question was at the time, but you were saying that they said something. But what I'm been learning in Adventism all this time, which I thought was right, is that daily is that of course the sacrifices. But when Christ died on the cross and the sanctuary at that time was rent in two, that's when the daily was done. No more sacrificial, that real, that where Christ was involved because the sacrifice had already been done. Christ died on the cross. It was terminated at that point. So there was no more daily thereafter because for what? Christ already died.
Um, in the prophecy of Daniel 9, what you just said is correct. In the prophecy of Daniel 9, which is talking about the coming of Jesus, it says he shall make an end to sin. He shall bring an end to the sacrifices and all of that. In Daniel chapter 9, which we will get to eventually, but this I believe is the correct interpretation where that chapter is concerned. But in the prophecy of Daniel 8 and chapter 11, this is not the interpretation at all. It's not talking about that sacrifice. You you know, as we all know, that the sacrifice of Jesus The sacrifice of the lambs, the sanctuary service,
Mhm.
represented the ministry of Jesus Christ.
Right.
If you come upon a prophecy, like for example the prophecy of Revelation, in Revelation you see Christ as a slain lamb. You see Jesus offering incense. This has to be applied on our side of the cross because this is after the death of Jesus. So you know when you see a sanctuary, you're not thinking of the earthly sanctuary. When you see a slain lamb, you're not thinking of an animal. When you see incense being offered, you're not thinking of literal incense. In the same way, when it talks about the daily sacrifice, you're not looking at those services. You are looking at what did they represent? What is the reality of these things? This is the thing that was taken away by the little horn. So, because the prophecy applies on our side of the cross, you have to apply the symbols in terms of the New Testament understanding.
Right. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, Sister Lorena.